$15 billion. That was the prize. A fortune so vast it could buy anything. Gleaming hotels across the globe, a seat in the president's cabinet, even a governor's mansion. But for the Pritzker family, all that money couldn't buy loyalty. This is the story of how one of America's most powerful dynasties collapsed into a vicious civil war, pitting cousin against cousin and even father against child. It's a brutal, messy fight driven by the one thing they had far too much of: cash. To understand how a family could go to war over a fortune, you first have to understand how that fortune was built. It didn't begin with a grand vision for a hotel empire, but with the quiet, methodical ambition of two brothers in the industrial heartland of Chicago. They didn't just want to be rich, they wanted to build a machine that would generate wealth forever, a machine that would run in the shadows far from public view. The Pritzker machine, forged in the furnaces of Chicago's industrial heartland, was a marvel of quiet efficiency. A.N. and Jack Pritzker had created a system, a fortress of trusts and holding companies designed to perpetually accumulate wealth while remaining almost invisible. But a fortress, no matter how well designed, must eventually be passed to new hands. The third generation of Pritzkers, A.N.'s sons, Jay, Robert, and Donald, were not just heirs, they were the designated successors, each groomed to command a different flank of the family's ever-expanding army of assets. Jay, the eldest, was the designated successor to A.N., the cool-headed strategist and dealmaker. He was a lawyer by training, like his grandfather Nicholas, but his true talent lay in seeing value where others saw none. Robert, the second son, was an engineer, a practical and brilliant industrialist who would take the hodgepodge of manufacturing companies they owned and build them into the formidable Marmon Group, a multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate. The Marmon Group was the engine room of the Pritzker empire, the source of the steady, immense cash flow that would fund their more glamorous ventures. And then there was Donald, the youngest, the most charismatic, the one with the human touch. While Jay and Robert were masters of balance sheets and legal structures, Donald was a master of people. He had a natural warmth and an infectious enthusiasm that drew people to him. He was the heart of the operation, and it was his vision that would catapult the Pritzker name from the quiet backrooms of Chicago finance into the global spotlight. And so, the Pritzker machine became a fortress of quiet, immense wealth, a masterclass in industrial accumulation and legal fortification. But an empire built on the principle of finding hidden value in unexpected places develops a certain kind of instinct, a constant scanning of the horizon for the next undervalued opportunity. It was precisely this instinct that would soon be triggered, not in a Chicago boardroom surrounded by lawyers, but in the noisy, sun-drenched coffee shop of a California motel, where the future of travel was unfolding before their very eyes. The moment that changed everything came not in a boardroom, but in a coffee shop. The year was 1957. Jay Pritzker was in Los Angeles, sitting at a table in a small cafe near the Los Angeles International Airport, a place that was rapidly becoming one of the busiest travel hubs in the world. He was waiting for a flight, just another businessman passing through. But Jay wasn't like other businessmen. His eyes were always open, his mind always calculating. He noticed the motel next to the coffee shop. It was called the Hyatt House. It was constantly busy, a hive of activity with pilots, flight attendants, and travelers checking in and out at all hours. An idea sparked in his mind. The age of jet travel was just dawning, and the world was about to become a much smaller place. People would need places to stay near airports, and the existing options were often grim and uninspired. He saw not just a motel, but a concept. He walked over, found the owner, a man named Hyatt Von Deen, and, in a move that has become legendary in the annals of business history, supposedly scrawled a deal on a cocktail napkin. Jay offered $2.2 million. The deal was done. It seemed like a small, almost impulsive purchase for a family with such vast and diversified holdings. AN was reportedly skeptical. The family was in the business of buying distressed industrial assets, not running motels. But Jay, with his quiet confidence, saw the bigger picture. He didn't just buy a building, he bought a foothold in the future of travel. He handed the project to his younger brother Donald, and it was here that the Pritzker magic truly began to take shape. Donald didn't just manage the first Hyatt house, he poured his soul into it. He understood something fundamental that his more financially minded brothers perhaps didn't. Hospitality wasn't about assets and liabilities. It was about people. It was about creating an experience. He focused on impeccable service, on making guests feel valued, and on building a team of employees who felt like they were part of a family. He was a constant presence in the early Hyatt Hotels, talking to bellhops, checking in with housekeepers, and personally greeting guests. He believed that if you treated your employees well, they would in turn treat the guests well. It was a simple philosophy, but at the time it was revolutionary in the often impersonal hotel industry. This became known as the Pritzker way, a management philosophy that empowered employees and fostered a sense of ownership and pride. Under Donald's leadership, with Jay securing the financing and scouting new locations, the Hyatt brand began a period of explosive growth. But they didn't just build more hotels, they built better, more audacious ones. They understood that to stand out, they had to be different. The turning point came in 1967 with the opening of the Hyatt Regency Atlanta. This wasn't just a hotel, it was a statement. Designed by architect John Portman, it defied every convention of hotel design. Instead of a cramped, low-ceilinged lobby, the Hyatt Regency Atlanta featured a breathtaking 22-story atrium, a soaring interior space with glass elevators that glided up and down like futuristic capsules. It was a spectacle, a destination in itself. It was an instant sensation and became one of the most influential buildings of the 20th century, single-handedly launching the trend of atrium lobbies in hotels around the world. The Pritzkers had changed the game. A Hyatt was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a place to be seen, to experience. They followed this success with other architectural marvels, like the Hyatt Regency O'Hare in Chicago and the Hyatt Regency San Francisco, each one a unique and dramatic addition to the city's skyline. They were building an empire of glass and steel, an empire that was very public, very glamorous, and a world away from the secretive, low-profile industrial holdings that had been the family's bedrock for decades. This was the golden age. The three brothers worked in perfect concert. Jay, the cool, detached strategist, would fly around the country, identifying new opportunities and structuring the complex deals to acquire land and financing. Donald, the charismatic builder, would then take over, overseeing the design and construction and infusing each new property with the Hyatt spirit. And all the while, Robert, the industrial genius, was quietly running the Marmon Group, generating the enormous profits that funded this rapid expansion. The family was at the peak of its powers, a perfectly balanced machine of finance, industry, and hospitality. They were the embodiment of the American dream, a dynasty that had turned a single immigrant's ambition into a global empire. But the very speed of their ascent was creating stresses beneath the surface. The public nature of the hotel business was a departure from the family's deep-seated tradition of privacy, and the empire was becoming increasingly reliant on the unique chemistry between the three brothers. Then, In 1972, tragedy struck. Donald Pritzker, the vibrant, energetic heart of the Hyatt empire, suffered a massive heart attack while playing tennis. He was just 39 years old. His death was sudden, shocking, and utterly devastating. For the family, it was an unimaginable loss. For the business, it was a catastrophe. The news didn't just travel, it ripped through the company from the boardrooms in Chicago to the bellhops in Atlanta. A silence fell over the atriums he had so proudly built. Donald was not just an executive. He was the soul of the company. He was the one who had built the culture, who had inspired the loyalty of thousands of employees. He remembered names, asked about families, and had a handshake that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. His loss left a gaping void, a sudden chilling emptiness at the core of everything. The emotional toll on his brothers was immense. Jay, in particular, was shattered. He had lost not just a brother, but his closest partner, the yin to his yang. They were a perfect team. Jay found the deals, and Don made them human. And now, the responsibility of running the day-to-day operations of the sprawling Hyatt chain fell squarely on his shoulders. It was a role he had never wanted, and frankly, one he felt ill-suited to play. Jay was a deal-maker, a strategist who thrived on the thrill of the acquisition, the complexity of a balance sheet, the art of the negotiation. He operated in a world of numbers, lawyers, and calculated risks. He was not a hotelier. He was not a people person in the way Donald had been. He didn't have the patience for the endless small details of hotel management, the thread count of the sheets, the flower arrangements in the lobby, the daily staff briefings. Jay was forced to step into his brother's shoes, to become the public face of a company that had been built on his brother's personal charisma. He had to stand before employees whose hands his brother had shaken, whose loyalty his brother had earned, and try to fill a silence that was deafening. How do you replace the irreplaceable? You can't. Jay had to find a new way forward, navigating his own profound grief while steering a ship that had just lost its captain in the middle of a storm. The years that followed were a period of consolidation and continued growth, but the spirit was different. Jay, ever the pragmatist, guided the company with a steady hand, but the joyful entrepreneurial energy that Donald had brought was gone. And then, in 1981, the family faced its darkest hour, a disaster that would tarnish the Hyatt name and haunt them for years to come. On the evening of July 17th, a tea dance was being held in the lobby of the Hyatt Regency, Kansas City. The hotel, which had opened just a year earlier, featured another of the brand's signature dramatic atriums, crisscrossed by elevated walkways. As hundreds of people danced below, two of these walkways, suspended one above the other, suddenly collapsed, crashing down onto the crowded lobby. The sound was described as a deafening crack, followed by a roar of falling steel and concrete. The aftermath was a scene of unimaginable horror. 114 people were killed and more than 200 were injured. It was, at the time, the deadliest structural collapse in American history. The investigation that followed revealed a catastrophic design flaw. A last-minute change to the design of the hanger rods supporting the walkways had doubled the stress on the connections, a fatal error that had gone unnoticed by the engineers and contractors. While Hyatt was not directly responsible for the engineering failure, the hotel was their brand. The Pritzker name, once a symbol of architectural innovation and luxury, was now linked to a horrific tragedy. The family, so accustomed to operating in the shadows, was thrust into a brutal and unforgiving public spotlight. They faced hundreds of lawsuits, totaling billions of dollars. The legal battles would drag on for years, a constant, painful reminder of the disaster. Jay Pritzker, in his characteristically private and unemotional way, handled the crisis from behind the scenes, working with the lawyers and insurers to settle the claims. But the damage to the brand's reputation was immense, and the emotional scar on the family was deep. The Kansas City disaster was a brutal lesson in the risks of their own ambition. Their desire to build bigger, more spectacular buildings had, in this case, contributed to a terrible tragedy. In the midst of these challenges, Jay sought to reshape the family's legacy, to create something that would endure beyond the world of business and controversy. In 1979, he and his wife Cindy established the Pritzker Architecture Prize. It was a brilliant move. The prize, often referred to as the Nobel Prize of Architecture, awarded $100,000 annually to a living architect who had produced significant and consistent work. It was a way to honor the art form that had been so central to their success, to associate the Pritzker name not with a tragic structural failure, but with architectural genius and cultural philanthropy. It was a way to build a different kind of legacy, one made of prestige and goodwill rather than just steel and glass. But even this act of philanthropy couldn't erase the growing cracks within the family itself. The death of the great patriarch, A.N. Pritzker, in 1986 marked the end of an era. The man who had held the family together through sheer force of will was gone. The intricate system of trust he and Jack had created, the system designed to hold the family's wealth in a single, indivisible pool, was now in the hands of the third and fourth generations. And the unspoken rule that had governed the family for decades, that Pritzkers don't sue Pritzkers, was about to be broken. The stage was set for a civil war. The death of Abram A.N. Pritzker in 1986 was more than just the passing of a patriarch. It was the removal of the keystone from the arch of the Pritzker Empire. For over half a century, his will, his ambition, and his absolute authority had been the gravity that held the family and its sprawling assets in a tight, cohesive orbit. His brother Jack, the legal architect, had passed away years earlier. Now only the third generation remained, led by the cool and calculating Jay Pritzker. Jay was A.N.'s heir in every sense of the word. He was brilliant, a master of the complex deal, and he understood the intricate web of trust that formed the family's financial DNA better than anyone. But Jay was not his father. He was more remote, more of an intellectual strategist than a domineering patriarch. And he was getting older. The fourth generation of Pritzkers, the 11 cousins who were the beneficiaries of the trusts, were coming of age. They had been raised in a world of unimaginable wealth, but they were a diverse group with their own ideas, their own ambitions, and, crucially, a growing desire for the kind of autonomy the family's rigid, centralized structure was designed to prevent. After A.N.'s death, a new leadership structure emerged, a triumvirate designed to guide the empire into the next century. At its head was Jay. Beside him were two younger men, carefully chosen to represent the future. The first was his own son, Thomas Pritzker. Tom was the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take over. He was serious, intense, and had dedicated his entire life to the family business, learning the intricate details of the Marmon Group and Hyatt. The second was Jay's cousin, Nicholas Nick Pritzker, the son of the co-founder, Jack. Nick was a respected figure within the family, a calm and detail-oriented executive who ran Hyatt's development arm, overseeing the construction of new hotels around the world. On the surface, this triumvirate, Jay the patriarch, Tom the heir, and Nick the trusted cousin, seemed like a stable and logical succession plan. They would manage the family's collective assets, now estimated to be worth well over $15 billion, for the benefit of all. But beneath this veneer of corporate order, the foundations of the family were beginning to decay. The unspoken pact of absolute loyalty, the ironclad rule that Pritzkers do not question Pritzkers, was starting to rust. The problem lay in the very structure that A.N. and Jack had so ingeniously created. The trusts were a maze, a labyrinth of legal entities designed to be impenetrable from the outside and controlled by a select few on the inside. For decades, this had worked perfectly. The cousins received generous distributions, lived lives of luxury, and were taught from a young age not to ask too many questions about the source of their wealth. It was simply the family business. But as the 1990s progressed, a sense of unease began to ripple through the younger generation. They felt disconnected from the decision-making, treated more like beneficiaries of a mysterious fund than stakeholders in a family enterprise. The real catalyst for the explosion, however, would come from a deeply personal and painful family schism. It involved Jay's brother, Robert Pritzker, the industrialist who ran the Marmon Group. In the early 1990s, Robert went through a bitter divorce from his second wife, Irene. The children from that marriage, Liesl and Matthew, were caught in the crossfire. The divorce was acrimonious, and Robert's relationship with his children became strained, a painful private matter that would soon have very public and devastating consequences for the entire Pritzker clan. Liesl Pritzker was not a typical heiress. The world knew her not as a Pritzker, but as Liesl Matthews, a successful child actress. In 1995, at the age of 9, she starred in the critically acclaimed film A Little Princess, and later appeared alongside Harrison Ford in the blockbuster Air Force One. She was a talented young actress with a promising career, living a life that seemed a world away from the arcane complexities of her family's financial empire. She and her brother Matthew were largely shielded from the business, their trusts managed for them by their father and the family office. But as Liesl grew older and enrolled as a student at Columbia University, she began to do something no Pritzker of her generation had dared to do before. She started asking questions, simple questions at first. She wanted to understand her trusts. She wanted to see the financial statements. She wanted to know what she was worth. And with every question she asked, the walls of the family fortress began to close in. She was met with evasion, with paternalistic reassurances that everything was being taken care of, and with the clear, unspoken message that she was breaking the rules. What Liesl and Matthew slowly began to uncover was a shocking secret, a betrayal that struck at the very heart of the family's professed values of loyalty and trust. In 1994, in the wake of Robert's messy divorce, the senior members of the family, Jay, Robert, and Tom, had made a series of secret decisions. They had systematically begun to empty the trusts established for Liesl and Matthew. Millions of dollars were moved. Assets were sold and transferred. In essence, their inheritance was being siphoned off and redistributed into other family trusts, primarily those controlled by the senior Pritzkers and their children. The family would later argue this was part of a broader necessary restructuring. But from Liesl's perspective, it looked like theft. They discovered that their father, in what court documents would later call an act of unimaginable greed and betrayal, had effectively sold their shares in the family holding companies back to the family for a fraction of their value, and then had the proceeds redirected. Liesl, the little princess from the movies, found herself in a real-life Gothic tale, a young woman fighting a secretive and powerful cabal that included her own father and cousins. In 2002, the unthinkable happened. Liesl Pritzker, then just 18 years old, filed a lawsuit in a Chicago court. She sued her father, Robert, her cousin, Tom, and other family members. Her brother, Matthew, soon joined the suit. The court filings were explosive, sending shockwaves through the worlds of business and finance. The intensely private Pritzkers were suddenly exposed, their internal affairs laid bare for all to see. The lawsuit accused the defendants of fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. It claimed they had engaged in a decade-long scheme to plunder Liesl and Matthew's trusts, stealing what amounted to over $1 billion from each of them. The details were sordid and specific. The suit alleged that the senior Pritzkers had treated the family's trusts like a personal piggy bank, moving money around at will to fund their own investments, cover losses, and enrich their own branches of the family at the expense of others. They had, the lawsuit claimed, cooked the books, created fraudulent paperwork, and lied to the children about the state of their finances. The family's code of silence had been shattered by a bomb of litigation. The family's reaction was a mixture of fury and panic. This was their worst nightmare. For a century, they had operated on the principle of absolute discretion. Now a teenage girl was threatening to pull back the curtain and reveal all their secrets. They fought back, of course. Their lawyers filed motions to dismiss the case, to seal the records, to keep the sordid details out of the press. They portrayed Liesl as a greedy and ungrateful child, manipulated by her mother and lawyers. But the damage was done. The lawsuit was a catalyst. It acted as a lightning rod for all the pent-up frustrations and resentments that had been simmering among the other cousins for years. They saw Liesl's courage, and it emboldened them. If the family's leaders were capable of doing this to two of their youngest members, what else had they been doing? The trust that had bound the family together was completely gone. What the lawsuit ultimately revealed was an even bigger secret. It turned out that the family had already decided their empire was unsustainable. J. Pritzker, who had died in 1999, had foreseen the coming storm. He knew that the fourth generation would not be content to live under the old rules. In 2001, before Liesl's lawsuit was even filed, the 11 adult cousins had gathered for a series of secret meetings. They had reached a monumental and, at the time, completely confidential agreement. They were going to do the one thing A.N. and Jack had designed the entire system to prevent. They were going to break up the empire. It was to be a great unwinding, a decade-long plan to systematically carve up the $15 billion fortune. Each of the 11 cousins would receive their share, an estimated $1.4 billion each. To generate the cash, they would have to sell off major assets and take their crown jewel, the Hyatt Hotels Corporation, public. It was the only way to avoid a full-scale civil war. Liesl's lawsuit simply ripped the veil off this secret plan and accelerated the process. She and her brother had been excluded from the 2001 agreement, a fact that only strengthened their legal case. They had been written out of the family's future. The legal battle raged for nearly 3 years, a brutal and emotionally draining affair. It pitted father against child, cousin against cousin. Finally, in early 2005, a settlement was reached. The family agreed to pay Liesl and Matthew approximately $500 million each. While it was less than the billion they had claimed they were owed, it was a staggering sum and a clear admission of wrongdoing. To avoid a public trial and the potential for even more damaging revelations, the family chose to pay. But the price was far higher than the $1 billion they handed over. The Pritzker dynasty, as a unified monolithic entity, was finished. The lawsuit had exposed the dark side of their carefully crafted system. The trust designed to protect and preserve the family's wealth across generations had instead become weapons, used by one branch of the family against another. The culture of secrecy that had enabled their rise had also enabled a profound betrayal. The family had survived the Great Depression, world wars, and tragic accidents, but it could not survive itself. The empire hadn't been conquered by an outside force. It had rotted from within. The settlement ended the lawsuit, but it ignited a firestorm of consequences that would be far more destructive than the legal battle itself. Liesel's lawsuit had dragged a secret family pact into the light, a monumental plan to do the unthinkable and dismantle the entire empire. This great unwinding was no longer a secret. It was now a public mandate. For the Pritzker family, the real grinding work of their self-destruction had just begun. What followed was a decade-long, monumentally complex process of corporate surgery. Imagine trying to untangle a century's worth of business deals, real estate holdings, and private companies, all woven together through a labyrinth of trusts so convoluted that only a handful of family members truly understood them. It was a task that would have crushed most families. But the Pritzkers, even in their fractured state, approached it with the same ruthless, unsentimental pragmatism that had built the empire in the first place. The man at the center of this storm was Thomas Pritzker. As J. Pritzker's chosen successor, the burden fell on him to preside over the dissolution of his grandfather's kingdom. It was a deeply ironic position. He had been groomed his entire life to lead the unified Pritzker dynasty, and now his primary job was to break it into pieces and hand the cash to his warring cousins. He had to be both the executioner and the undertaker of the family's old way of life. The process was methodical. The family, led by Tom, Nick, and Penny Pritzker, another of Jay's nieces who had become a formidable business force in her own right, had to figure out how to generate $15 billion in liquid cash to pay off the 11 cousins without destroying the underlying value of their assets in a fire sale. The first and most symbolic asset to go on the block was the Marmon Group. This was the industrial heart of the empire, the collection of over 100 manufacturing companies that Robert Pritzker had so brilliantly assembled. It was the engine that had produced the steady, quiet cash that funded the glamorous expansion of Hyatt. Selling Marmon was like selling the family's soul. In 2007, a deal was struck with the one man in America whose name carried as much financial weight as their own, Warren Buffett. Berkshire Hathaway agreed to acquire Marmon in a deal valued at over $4.5 billion. It was a quiet, respectful transaction between two titans of American business, a stark contrast to the noisy, bitter family feud that had necessitated it. The sale of Marmon was a clear signal to the world. The old Pritzker empire was officially being liquidated. The next and even more significant step was to take their crown jewel public, Hyatt Hotels. For 50 years, Hyatt had been the family's private property, its public face, but its private treasure. Taking it public meant exposing its finances to the scrutiny of Wall Street, surrendering a degree of control, and fundamentally changing the culture of the company. It was the ultimate violation of the old Pritzker code of privacy, but they had no choice. They needed the cash. In November 2009, in the midst of a global financial crisis, Hyatt Hotels Corporation held its initial public offering, raising over $1 billion. Tom Pritzker stood on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and rang the opening bell. It was a moment of triumph for the company, but a deeply bittersweet moment for the family. The IPO was a success, but it marked the final, irreversible end of the Pritzker dynasty as a private, unified entity. Other assets were sold off in the ensuing years: their stake in the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line, the credit reporting agency TransUnion, and countless other smaller holdings. Piece by piece, the empire AN had built was dismantled and turned into cash. But the end of the unified empire was not the end of Pritzker power. It was a metamorphosis. The breakup didn't destroy their wealth. It atomized it. Instead of one massive centralized star, the Pritzker universe was now made up of multiple fiercely independent constellations, each one a center of immense gravity in its own right. The cousins, now armed with fortunes of over $1 billion each and freed from the constraints of the family's collective structure, went on to build their own empires, taking the Pritzker name and influence into spheres their grandfather could have never imagined. Thomas Pritzker remained as the keeper of the original flame. As the executive chairman of the now public Hyatt, he was the face of the family's most enduring legacy. He navigated the company through the treacherous waters of the public markets, continuing to expand its global footprint. He carried the weight of the family name, a name now synonymous with both luxury and internal strife, and managed to maintain its prestige in the corporate world. His cousin, Penny Pritzker, emerged as one of the most powerful and influential members of her generation. Even before the breakup, she had built her own successful real estate investment firms. But with her newfound liquidity, she turned her focus to a new arena: national politics. A longtime friend and supporter of a charismatic young politician from her home state of Illinois named Barack Obama, Penny became a key figure in his rise. She was the national finance chair for his 2008 presidential campaign, a fundraising powerhouse who helped him shatter records. Her business acumen and loyalty were rewarded when, in 2013, President Obama appointed her as the United States Secretary of Commerce. It was a stunning achievement. A Pritzker, from a family that had spent a century avoiding the public eye, was now a member of the president's cabinet, shaping American economic policy. Penny wasn't the only Pritzker with political ambitions. Her younger brother, J.B. Pritzker, also used his inheritance to forge a path in business and politics. He co-founded the Pritzker Group, a private equity firm that continued the family tradition of investing in and managing a diverse portfolio of companies. But his ultimate goal was public office. After an unsuccessful run for Congress early in his career, he set his sights on the highest office in his home state. In 2018, using his vast personal fortune to fund his campaign, J.B. Pritzker was elected the 43rd governor of Illinois. The Pritzker family, which had long exerted quiet influence behind the scenes in Chicago politics, now held the governor's mansion. The irony was profound. The breakup, born of a desire for individual control, had resulted in the family achieving a level of overt political power they had never had when they were a unified force. Other cousins took their fortunes in entirely different directions. Gigi Pritzker, JB's sister, turned away from the worlds of business and politics and toward the glamour of Hollywood. She founded her own film production company, Odd Lot Entertainment, becoming a respected producer of independent and major studio films, including the critically acclaimed thriller Drive and the sci-fi epic Ender's Game. She carved out a niche for herself in an industry notoriously difficult to break into, proving that the Pritzker drive and business savvy could be applied to the creative arts as well. And then there was Liesl Pritzker Simmons, the young woman who had started it all. After the settlement, she could have easily disappeared from public life, her fortune secured. Instead, she did something remarkable. She and her husband, Ian Simmons, dedicated themselves to the world of impact investing. It was a direct and powerful rebuke to the old Pritzker way of doing business. While her family had built its fortune in the secretive, morally ambiguous world of trusts and tax avoidance, Liesl used her inheritance to fund companies and initiatives that were transparent, ethical, and aimed at creating positive social and environmental change. She became a leading voice in a movement that argues that financial returns and social good are not mutually exclusive. The rebel who had sued her family for financial transparency had become a champion of it on a global scale. Her personal journey from child actress to legal warrior to philanthropic innovator was perhaps the most compelling story to emerge from the wreckage of the family empire. So what is the lasting legacy of the Pritzker family? Their story is a paradoxical epic, both the tragic fall of a great American dynasty and the liberation of its individual members to reach unprecedented heights of power. It's a cautionary tale showing how the secrecy that builds an empire can also rot it from within, proving that the most valuable assets, trust, loyalty, and honesty, cannot be held in a trust fund. The Pritzker name, once a symbol of unified, shadowy power, is now a testament to both brilliant innovation and the devastating cost of a family at war with itself.